You wake up before the sun, not because you're rested, but because your mind is already racing. There's no predator chasing you, no famine threatening your survival, no war outside your window. And yet, your chest feels heavy. Your thoughts are fogged with dread. You scroll through your phone, searching for something, anything that might make the morning feel less hollow. Notifications blink like artificial stars, but none of them warm you. You shower, dress, commute, perform. You smile when expected, you nod when required, you laugh when prompted. And still, something inside you whispers, "This isn't it." You live in the safest, most connected, most materially abundant era in human history. And yet, you feel like you're drowning in invisible waters. You're not alone. The numbers are staggering. Depression rates have surged across generations, especially among the young. Pharmaceutical companies thrive. Therapists are booked months in advance. Mental health apps flood the market. And still, the emptiness grows. How can it be that in an age where suffering has been technologically minimized, despair has been culturally maximized? Why is it that the very society that promised liberation from hunger, disease, and ignorance has delivered instead a silent epidemic of meaninglessness? You were told you were free, yet you feel trapped. You were told you were connected, yet you feel alone. You were told you were progressing, yet you feel as though you are regressing into some private abyss. Consider the paradox. Never before has humanity been so shielded from the raw brutality of nature, and yet never before have so many felt crushed by the weight of existence itself. Depression is not merely a private affliction, it has become a cultural signature, a watermark of modernity. It is as though society itself manufactures despair, packaging it in the very structures that claim to protect you. The office cubicle, the endless feed of curated lives, the relentless demand for productivity, the quiet tyranny of comparison. All of it conspires to whisper into your psyche, "You are not enough." And so you ask yourself, what is wrong with me? But perhaps the more disturbing question is, what if nothing is wrong with you at all? What if the sickness is not in the individual, but in the air we breathe, the systems we inhabit, the values we are taught to worship? What if depression is not merely a personal failure, but the inevitable byproduct of a society that has confused comfort with fulfillment, distraction with connection, consumption with meaning? Imagine standing in a crowded train, surrounded by faces illuminated by the cold glow of their screens. Each person is scrolling, swiping fragments of other lives. Each is connected to thousands, yet speaking to no one. Each is performing a role in the silent theater of modern existence. And beneath the surface of this performance lies a quiet despair, a gnawing suspicion that life has been reduced to a series of transactions, metrics, and appearances. You sense it in yourself, you sense it in them, but no one dares to name it aloud. Is it possible that depression is not merely a chemical imbalance in the brain, but a spiritual imbalance in the culture? That what we call a disorder may in fact be a rational response to a disordered world? If so, then the question is not simply how to treat depression, but how to confront the society that breeds it. And yet, here lies the unsettling paradox. The very society that manufactures depression also sells you its cures. Pills, apps, therapies, retreats, self-help books, all promising relief, all commodifying your suffering into another marketable product. You are told healing is possible, but only if you buy, subscribe, consume. The system that wounds you also profits from your attempt to heal. Is this not the most insidious cycle of all? You begin to wonder, what if depression is not merely an anomaly, but a feature? What if it is not a glitch in the system, but the system's most reliable output? After all, a population weighed down by despair is easier to control, easier to distract, easier to sell to. A restless soul is a consuming soul. A lonely heart is a profitable heart. Could it be that your sadness is not only tolerated by society, but required by it? And so, the great question emerges, heavy and unavoidable. Is modern society designed to keep you well or to keep you subdued? If depression is the shadow cast by our civilization's brightest promises, then what does that say about the promises themselves? You feel the weight of this question pressing against your chest, more unsettling than the heaviness you woke up with. Because if the roots of despair are not merely in you, but in the very structures you inhabit, then the path to healing is not simply inward, it is also outward. It demands not only self-examination, but cultural examination. Not only therapy, but philosophy. Not only coping, but questioning. And so you stand at the threshold of a deeper inquiry. The question is no longer why am I depressed, but why has society made depression its silent anthem? To step into this inquiry is to risk seeing the world differently, to risk dismantling the illusions that keep you docile. But it is also to risk liberation. The next step is to uncover the hidden machinery, the psychological and philosophical roots that make this epidemic not accidental, but inevitable. To see how the very ideas that shape our culture have quietly reshaped your mind. To trace the lineage of despair back to its source. And so we move forward into the hidden problem.
You sense it already, that the heaviness you carry is not simply yours, but something woven into the very fabric of the age. To understand why modern society manufactures depression, we must descend beneath the surface of symptoms and statistics, into the subterranean roots where psychology and philosophy intertwine. For depression is not only a medical condition, it is also a mirror, reflecting the contradictions of the civilization that produces it. Think of Freud, who once suggested that civilization itself is the source of our discontent. He argued that in order to live together, we repress our instincts, our primal desires, our raw vitality. We trade freedom for safety, instinct for order, passion for predictability. The result is a society that functions, yes, but at the cost of inner vitality. What Freud could not have foreseen is how this repression would evolve in the modern age, where the chains are no longer iron, but invisible, woven from algorithms, advertisements, and social expectations. You are not whipped into obedience, you are seduced into conformity. And yet the psychic cost remains the same, a gnawing sense of alienation from your own authentic self. Nietzsche too warned of this. He saw the rise of what he called the last man, a creature of comfort, safety, and mediocrity, who avoids risk, avoids suffering, avoids depth. The last man is content with shallow pleasures, with entertainment, with distraction. But Nietzsche's warning was not about comfort itself, it was about the spiritual emptiness that comes when comfort becomes the highest value. For in such a world, greatness withers, creativity suffocates, and the soul starves. Depression then may be the cry of the soul against a culture that has traded meaning for convenience. From a psychological perspective, the modern self is caught in a double bind. On one hand, you are told to be unique, to find yourself, to stand out. On the other, you are pressured to conform, to fit into the machinery of productivity, to measure your worth by external metrics, grades, salaries, likes, followers. This contradiction creates a psychic fracture. You are asked to be both authentic and standardized, both free and obedient, both individual and interchangeable. How can one not feel torn apart by such demands? Sociologist Emil Durkheim, writing over a century ago, described a condition he called anomie, a state of normlessness where traditional values collapse but no new ones take their place.
In such a vacuum, individuals feel rootless, adrift, disconnected from any larger purpose. Is this not precisely the condition of modern life? Old religious frameworks have weakened, communal bonds have frayed, and yet the new gods, technology, consumerism, progress, offer no true sanctuary for the soul. They promise stimulation, not salvation. They give you endless choice, but no compass. And so depression emerges not as a random affliction, but as the logical consequence of a society that has dismantled meaning without replacing it. The philosopher Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps, argued that the deepest human drive is not pleasure, as Freud believed, nor power, as Nietzsche suggested, but meaning. When meaning collapses, the psyche collapses with it. And in modern society, meaning is constantly eroded by the relentless churn of consumption. You are told that happiness lies in the next purchase, the next upgrade, the next achievement. But each acquisition leaves you emptier than before, because what you crave is not possession, but purpose. Consider also the role of time. In ancient cultures, time was cyclical, tied to the rhythms of nature, the seasons, the eternal return. In modern society, time is linear, fragmented, monetized. Every second is measured, optimized, scheduled. You are told that time is money, and so you live in constant debt to the clock. This temporal pressure corrodes the psyche, leaving you perpetually anxious, perpetually behind, perpetually insufficient. Depression in this sense is the body's rebellion against the tyranny of linear time. It is the refusal of the soul to be reduced to a productivity machine. And then there is the question of identity. In the digital age, identity is no longer something you discover, it is something you perform. You curate yourself for the gaze of others, constructing a persona that is always slightly detached from who you really are. The philosopher Jean Baudrillard called this the age of simulacra, where images no longer reflect reality, but replace it. You do not simply live, you broadcast. You do not simply feel, you post. And in this endless performance, the authentic self withers. Depression may be the silent protest of the self against its own commodification. But perhaps the most insidious root of all is the way society has medicalized despair. By framing depression solely as a chemical imbalance, we obscure its cultural and existential dimensions. Yes, biology plays a role, but to reduce depression to neurotransmitters is to ignore the deeper truth that despair is often a rational response to a world stripped of meaning, connection, and authenticity. By pathologizing the individual, society absolves itself of responsibility. The problem is not the system, we are told, it is you. Take this pill, download this app, and return to work. And so the hidden problem reveals itself. Depression is not merely an illness of the individual, but a symptom of a civilization that has lost its way. It is the shadow cast by a society that worships progress but forgets purpose, that celebrates connection but fosters isolation, that promises freedom but delivers conformity. The question now is, what are the consequences of living in such a world? If depression is the logical outcome of modern society's values, then what does that mean for the future of humanity? What happens when despair becomes the default condition of an entire culture? The answer lies in the unseen consequences, the ways in which this silent epidemic shapes not only individual lives, but the very trajectory of civilization itself. And it is there, in the shadows of our collective psyche, that the true danger and the possibility of awakening awaits.
You may think of depression as a private affliction, something that happens inside the sealed chamber of your own mind. But what if it is not only personal, but civilizational? What if the despair you feel is not just your own, but the echo of a collective wound? The unseen consequences of a society that manufactures depression are vast, subtle, and devastating. They shape not only how you feel, but how entire cultures evolve, how politics unfolds, how economies function, how history itself is written. Consider first the erosion of intimacy. When depression becomes widespread, relationships are no longer sanctuaries, but fragile negotiations between two exhausted souls. You see it in the way conversations shrink into exchanges of data rather than communion of hearts. You see it in the way couples sit across from each other in restaurants, each staring into the glow of a screen rather than the glow of each other's eyes. Depression isolates, and isolation breeds more depression. The cycle feeds itself until loneliness becomes the default condition of modern life. And loneliness is not benign. Neuroscience shows that chronic isolation activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The body interprets loneliness as a wound. Over time, this wound corrodes not only the psyche, but the immune system, the cardiovascular system, even the brain's architecture. A society of lonely individuals is a society of weakened bodies, shortened lifespans, diminished vitality. Depression, then, is not only a psychological epidemic, it is a biological one. But the consequences extend further still. A population weighed down by despair becomes politically malleable. When people feel powerless in their own lives, they are more likely to surrender power to external authorities. When they feel disconnected from meaning, they are more susceptible to ideologies that promise certainty. When they feel unseen, they are more vulnerable to demagogues who claim to see them. Depression, in this sense, is not only a personal tragedy, but a political strategy. A despairing population is easier to govern, easier to distract, easier to manipulate. Economically, depression is paradoxically profitable. Entire industries thrive on your sadness. The pharmaceutical industry, of course, but also the wellness industry, the self-help industry, the entertainment industry. Each offers temporary relief. Each commodifies your suffering into a product. The more you despair, the more you consume. The more you consume, the more the system thrives. Depression becomes not a threat to the economy, but its fuel. And so the system has no incentive to cure you, only to manage you, to keep you functional enough to work, but empty enough to buy. Culturally, the normalization of depression reshapes art, literature, and media. Stories become saturated with irony, cynicism, and despair. Music becomes a soundtrack of numbness. Humor becomes self-deprecating, a way of laughing at the very pain that cannot be spoken. Even language itself shifts. Words like burnout, anxiety, overwhelm become casual, everyday descriptors, as though despair were simply the weather of modern existence. When despair becomes normal, hope becomes radical. And then there is the most insidious consequence of all, the internalization of blame. When society manufactures depression, but frames it as an individual defect, you begin to see yourself as broken. You tell yourself you are weak, defective, inadequate. You compare yourself to the curated lives of others and conclude that you alone are failing. This self-blame deepens the despair, creating a spiral from which escape feels impossible. The system thrives precisely because you never suspect that the sickness is not in you, but in the world you inhabit. Psychologically, this creates what cognitive scientists call a learned helplessness. When you are repeatedly told that your suffering is your fault, you stop resisting, you stop questioning, you stop imagining alternatives. You accept despair as inevitable. And once despair is accepted as inevitable, the possibility of transformation vanishes. Depression becomes not only a symptom, but a worldview. Philosophically, this is catastrophic. For philosophy begins with wonder, with the belief that life can be questioned, that reality can be reimagined.
Depression extinguishes wonder. It convinces you that nothing matters, that nothing can change, that the future is only a repetition of the present. A society steeped in depression is a society that has lost its capacity to dream. And when dreaming dies, so does the possibility of revolution, of renewal, of rebirth. But here lies the paradox. Depression, though devastating, also carries within it a hidden potential. For despair is not only a collapse, it is also a signal. It tells you that something is profoundly wrong, not only within you, but around you. It's the psyche's way of refusing to adapt to a world unworthy of the human spirit. In this sense, depression may be the most honest response to modern society. It is the refusal of the soul to be pacified by shallow pleasures, the refusal of the heart to accept a life without meaning. And so the unseen consequences are double-edged. On one side, depression weakens, isolates, and subdues. On the other, it whispers of a deeper truth, that the world as it is cannot sustain the fullness of human life. Depression is both a wound and a summons. The question then is whether we will heed this summons. Will we continue to treat depression as a private defect, numbing it with distractions and medications? Or will we dare to see it as a cultural message, a call to reimagine the very foundations of our society? The path forward requires a radical shift in perspective. It requires breaking free from the illusions that bind us, reclaiming the capacity to dream, rediscovering the sources of meaning that cannot be bought or sold. It requires courage, the courage to see that the problem is not only within you, but within the civilization itself. And so we arrive at the threshold of transformation. The unseen consequences have been laid bare. The next step is to ask, how do we break free? How do we reclaim our minds, our hearts, our lives from a society that profits from our despair? The answer lies not in resignation, but in rebellion, not in escape, but in awakening. And it is to this awakening that we now turn.
You have seen the hidden machinery, the roots of despair, the unseen consequences that ripple through your life and through society. Now comes the most urgent question. How do you break free? How do you reclaim your mind, your soul, your humanity from a system that thrives on your emptiness? The answer is not simple, nor is it comfortable. For to break free is not merely to adjust your habits, but to reimagine your very relationship with the world. The first step is to recognize that the prison is invisible. You cannot dismantle what you cannot see. Begin by questioning the assumptions that govern your daily life. Why do you measure your worth by productivity? Why do you equate happiness with consumption? Why do you believe that your value lies in how others perceive you? These are not natural truths. They are cultural implants, ideas whispered into your psyche by a society that profits from your compliance. To break free, you must first unmask these illusions. Philosophers across history have offered guidance for such unmasking. The Stoics, for example, taught that freedom lies not in controlling the world, but in controlling your response to it. Epictetus, once a slave, declared that no one can enslave your mind unless you consent. In a world that constantly seeks to colonize your attention, this teaching is revolutionary. To reclaim your attention is to reclaim your life. Every time you resist the urge to scroll, every time you choose silence over noise, every time you act from intention rather than impulse, you are breaking free. But freedom is not only inward, it is also outward. Nietzsche urged us to become creators of values, to refuse the ready-made morality of the herd, and instead forge our own path. This does not mean reckless individualism, but courageous authenticity. It means asking, what do I truly value apart from what I have been told to value? What kind of life would I live if I were not performing for others? Depression thrives in the gap between who you are and who you pretend to be.
To close that gap is to begin healing. Psychologically, this requires a radical shift in perspective. Instead of seeing depression as a defect, see it as a signal. It is your psyche's way of telling you that something is profoundly misaligned. Rather than numbing it, listen to it. Ask, what is this pain pointing to? What truth is it trying to reveal? Often, depression points to the absence of meaning, the absence of connection, the absence of authenticity. To heed this signal is to begin the work of reconstruction, and reconstruction begins with meaning. Viktor Frankl, who endured the horrors of Auschwitz, discovered that those who survived were not necessarily the strongest, but those who had a why to live for. Meaning is not given, it is created. It is found in love, in service, in creativity, in the pursuit of truth. To break free from depression is not to chase happiness, but to cultivate meaning. Happiness is a byproduct, meaning is the foundation. Yet meaning cannot be pursued in isolation. Modern society isolates you, convinces you that you are an atom floating alone. But human beings are not atoms. We are networks, constellations, ecosystems. To break free is to rebuild community, to rediscover the power of genuine connection. This does not mean more followers, more likes, more digital acquaintances. It means fewer but deeper bonds. It means conversations that are not transactional, but transformative. It means choosing presence over performance. There is also the matter of time. Modern society enslaves you to the clock, to the endless race of deadlines and metrics. To break free is to reclaim time as sacred. This may mean slowing down, resisting the cult of busyness, rediscovering the rhythms of nature. It may mean walking without headphones, eating without screens, breathing without urgency. Such acts may seem small, but they are acts of rebellion against a culture that equates speed with value. And then there is art. Art is not a luxury, it is a necessity. In a world that commodifies everything, art is one of the few realms where meaning can still be created freely. To write, to paint, to sing, to dance, these are not hobbies, but acts of resistance. They remind you that you are not merely a consumer, but a creator. Depression tells you that nothing matters. Art replies, everything matters, because everything can be transformed into beauty. But perhaps the most radical act of all is to embrace suffering. Modern society teaches you to avoid pain at all costs, to anesthetize yourself with entertainment, medication, distraction. Yet the great philosophers and psychologists remind us that suffering is not the enemy, it is the crucible of growth. Nietzsche declared, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. Frankl insisted that even in suffering, one can find meaning. To break free is not to eliminate suffering, but to transmute it, to see in your pain not only a wound, but a teacher. This does not mean romanticizing depression. It means refusing to let it define you. It means seeing it as a passage, not a prison. It means asking, how can I use this pain to awaken, to deepen, to transform? Depression may be the shadow of modern society, but shadows exist only because there is light. To break free is to turn toward that light, however faint, and to walk toward it with courage. And so the path of liberation is both inward and outward. Inward, you reclaim your attention, your authenticity, your meaning. Outward, you rebuild community, resist commodification, create art, embrace time as sacred. Each act is small, but together they form a revolution of the soul. The question remains, what happens when enough individuals break free? What happens when despair is no longer internalized as weakness, but recognized as a cultural summons? What happens when depression ceases to be a private burden and becomes a collective awakening? The answer lies in the final realization, the deepest, most transformative insight of all. It is there, at the edge of despair, that a new vision of life emerges, and it is to that vision, that final revelation, that we now turn.
Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the edge of a vast canyon. Behind you lies the world you have always known.
the routines, the expectations, the invisible machinery that manufactures despair. Before you lies an abyss, terrifying in its depth, but shimmering with possibility. You feel the pull of gravity, the temptation to retreat into the familiar. But you also feel something else, the faint but undeniable call of freedom. This is the moment of realization, the moment when everything you thought you knew about depression, about society, about yourself, begins to fracture. The final realization is this: depression is not merely an illness to be cured, nor a weakness to be overcome. It is a message, a profound existential message from the depths of the human spirit. It tells you that the way we are living is unsustainable, that the values we worship are hollow, that the systems we obey are dehumanizing. Depression is not the enemy, it is the alarm. And like any alarm, its purpose is not to torment you, but to wake you. Think of it this way. If you place a canary in a coal mine and it begins to suffocate, you do not blame the bird. You do not medicate it into silence. You recognize that the air itself is poisoned. Depression is the canary of modern civilization. It is the soul's way of telling us that the cultural atmosphere has become toxic. To ignore it is to continue breathing poisoned air. To listen to it is to begin the work of purification. This realization changes everything. It means that your despair is not proof of your brokenness, but proof of your sensitivity. It means that your sadness is not a defect, but a form of intelligence, a deeper awareness of the gap between what is and what could be. It means that depression, far from being meaningless suffering, may be the very doorway to meaning itself. Philosophically, this is a radical shift. For centuries, we have been taught to see suffering as something to eliminate, to escape, to conquer. But the great traditions, Buddhism, Stoicism, existentialism, all whisper a different truth. Suffering is not the opposite of life, but the texture of life. To suffer is to feel deeply, to be awake to the fragility and beauty of existence. Depression, in its darkest form, is suffering without meaning. But when you recognize it as a message, as a summons, it transforms. It becomes not a void, but a threshold. Psychologically, this realization liberates you from self-blame. You are not defective. You are not weak. You are responding as any sensitive being would to a world that has lost its balance. The very fact that you feel despair is evidence that you are alive, that you have not been fully numbed, that some part of you still longs for truth. Depression is the refusal of the soul to accept a counterfeit life. It is the hunger for authenticity, for depth, for connection. And collectively, this realization has revolutionary implications. If depression is not merely an individual disorder, but a cultural signal, then healing cannot be limited to therapy sessions and prescriptions. Healing must also be societal. It must involve reimagining our values, our institutions, our ways of living. It must ask what kind of world would nourish the human spirit rather than suffocate it? What kind of society would cultivate meaning rather than manufacture despair? This is where the final paradox emerges. Depression, which feels like the end of everything, may in fact be the beginning of something new. It may be the birth pangs of a new consciousness, a new way of being human. Just as physical pain alerts the body to injury, depression alerts the culture to its sickness. And just as pain can lead to healing, despair can lead to transformation. But only if we listen, only if we resist the temptation to numb, to distract, to silence. Only if we dare to face the abyss and see in it not only darkness, but possibility. The abyss is terrifying, yes, but it is also fertile. Out of it, new values can be born. Out of it, new communities can be built. Out of it, a new vision of humanity can emerge.
And so the final realization is both personal and collective. Personally, it means that your despair is not meaningless. It is the seed of awakening. Collectively, it means that our epidemic of depression is not a sign of collapse, but a call to evolution. The question is whether we will answer that call. Picture again the canyon. Behind you, the old world of conformity, distraction, commodification. Before you, the abyss of uncertainty, but also of possibility. The leap is terrifying, but perhaps the greater danger is to remain where you are, suffocating in poisoned air. To leap is to risk falling, but to refuse to leap is to guarantee suffocation. The choice then is not between despair and comfort. It is between despair that imprisons and despair that awakens. Between depression as a dead end and depression as a doorway. Between a life of silent compliance and a life of radical authenticity. And so I leave you with this. What if your depression is not the end of your story, but the beginning of a new one? What if the very pain you carry is the proof that you are capable of more, that humanity itself is capable of more? What if the darkness you feel is not the absence of light, but the preparation of your eyes to see a brighter dawn? The final realization is not easy. It demands courage, honesty, and a willingness to step into the unknown. But it is also liberating, for once you see depression not as a defect, but as a message, not as an enemy, but as a guide, you are no longer its prisoner. You are its interpreter. And in that interpretation lies the possibility of freedom. So let the alarm ring, let the canary sing, let the abyss open. For in the very heart of despair lies the seed of transformation. And if enough of us listen, if enough of us awaken, then perhaps depression will not be the anthem of modern society, but the catalyst for its rebirth. This is the call. This is the summons. This is the moment to awaken. And if these words have stirred something in you, if they have unsettled you, provoked you, or opened a door you did not know there was, then stay with us. Subscribe, share, and join this journey. For the work of reimagining ourselves and our world has only just begun.